The Battle of Burning Branches. Year 4949, Rangarian calendar. Location, Elder's Valley. The frigid wind that came down from the peaks of the northern shield nipped at the warrior king's exposed face, and howled like the souls of the damned as it whipped through the melancholy landscape. Taltros sat upon the back of his trusty steed, a mighty swift-foot, which wore steel-plated armor, coated in the same gold as his own cuirass and helmet. He felt the mighty creature's body shiver, and couldn't help but feel remorse for it. Taltros had experienced winter before. Yerevan was far enough north to endure snowstorms and even the occasional blizzard, but the northern green was different. The northern green was unrelentingly cold. Even in his king's tent, tucked under the warmest of fur blankets, and with the fairest maiden the Rangarian countryside could offer in his arms, the frozen wind chilled Taltros to his bone marrow. He couldn't imagine what it was like for his steed, and much less for his loyalist. The night before, nearly half the rightful king's generals abandoned their posts and took their battalions of men with them. Bastards, all of them. Taltros had no need for them. Within the fortnight, he and his men would arrive at the undefended city of Ragorn. They would take the fortified city within a few days. From within the city, he and his men would await the Rangarian forces and would watch as the once mighty race tried and failed to besiege their own capital. By the time the Rangarian forces had grown tired, the Yerevan generals, who foolishly abandoned their king, would return and crush the Rangarians once and for all. This is what the Yerevan king told himself. But in the back of his mind, the truth ate away at him. Even if Ragorn was lightly defended in the queen's absence, he would still most likely suffer casualties if he besieged it, and that was something he could not afford, as he would need the men not only to control the city's populace, but also man the city's mighty walls. Even with his original 45,000 men, it would be a difficult task, but now, with only 15,000... He shook his head. Even if the odds were against him, he had no choice but to march forward. For if he turned back now, there was no telling what home he'd return to. He'd return a failure, a pariah that would be as likely to be stabbed by his former generals or his queen. That was, of course, if he returned at all. He heard the news by now. The Riemann king and Rangarian queen had settled their land disputes before he had even reached halfway through the empire. And he had heard rumors that that damned woman had called her entire army to arms and now rode north to her capital. He had heard whispers amongst his men about her, a dark-haired maiden with ice-blue eyes and skin as pale as snow, cunning ferocity that matched her appearance, cold as the northern isles. He heard that the ground blazed as she walked, and that the clouds parted as she and her forces marched, as if her blasted old god wanted to view her campaign himself. He knew these rumors were exaggerated, falsehoods created by imaginative minds to startle their enemies, but even still, he couldn't help but feel a chill travel down his spine as he thought of her and her loyal legions of rangers. "Sire," a low, gravelly voice came from Taltros' side. The king looked up to see his general and good friend, Sir Ramon Dantas, atop his own swift-foot steed. "Yes, Sir Dantas," Taltros replied as he looked back behind him to survey his forces. Lines of force stretched backwards into the narrow valley they had just crossed through. At their sides marched mighty long-necked beasts, behemoths, and a few hundred more men that sat atop swift-foots of their own. "We've reached the mountain's pathway's entrance, but it appears the entrance has been fortified. "Shall we prepare to make a siegecraft, sire?" Sir Dantus's voice faded into white noise as, while Taltros looked behind him at his troops, he saw it. Them. In a clearing across the valley, a line 4 swift-foots across, a cavalry unit. He pulled on his swift-foot's reins and turned the beast around to face his foe across the valley. Her cold blue eyes stared daggers across the valley at the line of would-be invaders, who now started to scramble into a formation. They were like insects. Small, pathetic insects, the kind a peasant would find in their bread case if they left it outside for too long. Queen Valaris, monarch of the Rangarian Empire, couldn't help but laugh at them as they desperately prepared for battle. "See them men," she called over her shoulder to the row upon row of cavalrymen and foot soldiers that stood behind her, spears at the ready. "These are the glorious crusaders that have come to reclaim their rightful land," she mocked. "I was expecting more from the all-powerful Yerevan." Her taunting yells were met with uproarious cheers and war cries from her soldiers. The queen rode forward a bit and turned to face her forces, who watched her, and even with the faces of outlandish beasts between her and them, she knew they looked towards her with admiration and respect, something she had earned years before. She had heard about the Yerevan king, rumors and gossip amongst her troops and citizens she encountered along her trek north that painted a picture of the king in her mind. Cowardly, weak-willed, self-entitled, and delusional beyond any measure. The rumors described a man who sat behind a wall, so absorbed in his own self-importance that he envisioned himself sitting upon a throne his ancestors had lost centuries ago through cowardice and incompetence. No amount of lavish armor and delusions of grandeur could change what his so-called crusade was. The dream of a stupid child. She couldn't wait to meet him in battle, to strip his helmet from his head with her own hands, and see the realization of his mistake sink in. That's when she would take his head from his shoulders. "Rangarians," she cried, and was answered by a harmonious holler from her troops. "These are the men that torched Ranga's countryside. These are the men that razed your fellow Rangarian's village, butchered your fellow man's son, and took his woman as their own. These same men are the descendants of countless generations of murderers, looters, and thieves." Even as the cold wind of the north whipped around her, she could feel the heat rising in her troops, a rage that could only be fueled by centuries of mistreatment and oppression. "You are the descendants of Ranga's first servants, born to protect his paradise, born to fight off the black-clad beasts and demons that once subjugated this world. Now those demons clad themselves in gold and purple capes. It is your duty as soldiers of Ranga to slay these gold-clad beasts, and it is my duty as Ranga's descendant to lead you into battle." Her men roared and hooted and hit the bottoms of their spears against the ground. They were ready. Valaris knew it. She lifted the helmet that she held under her arm and placed it upon her chainmail-enveloped head. She flipped down her helmet's visor, closing the mouth of a mighty plains drake that had been so skillfully etched into the metal of the helm. She raised her spear, and a battle cry escaped her lips as her swift foot reared up to its full height. Her men joined her and raised their spears into the air before charging behind her. Taltros looked at his men, and despite the frigid winds, a bead of sweat started to form on his brow. He turned back towards his men, who now stood in formation. He could see a few of their bodies shake, but couldn't tell if it was from fear or from the cold. He avoided their gazes, and when he rode forward and turned his swift foot back to face his men, he found it hard to speak. Centuries ago, these barbarians, these heathens. Taltros paused for a moment and turned to look at his enemies. Lined up on the top of a hill, their spears pointed like thousands of needles into the sky. A fire burned in his gut as he watched them, a rage that could only be sparked from decades of embarrassment and ridicule. He whipped his head around to face his men and spoke with a new passion, the passion he had when he had declared he would reclaim their lost territory. These beasts in the form of man, they destroyed the greatest civilization the world has ever known in favor of praying to a false god. For centuries the Yurvan have cowered behind our walls in fear of them. He pointed across the valley towards the steel-clad gathering. No longer will our people, our legacy, be insulted by a backwater race of heathens and murderers. From the corner of his eye he saw Sedantus. He saw a smile he had known his entire life stretched across his general's face, and as soon as he turned back to look upon his troops, he saw that their demeanor had shifted. He saw fire in their eyes, the same fire that burned in his blood was in them. He stabbed the butt of his spear into the cold ground below him and unsheathed the short sword on his belt. Today I fulfill the promise I made to you all those years ago. Today these Rangarian beasts will learn their place, and the name of Yurvan will regain not only its land, but the respect and the fear it deserves. Taltros smiled as he watched his most loyal men raise their spears into the air and cheer for their king. Silently, the king placed his helmet over his head and turned back to face his men once more. For Oba! For Oba! His men echoed. Elder's Valley was small, only about a mile across and 4 long, with gentle sloping hills and a rather small, slow-moving river in the center. The calmness of the small valley is how it got its name, named after Ragnar's wife and the fairest maiden to ever live. The valley was clear of trees, as most had been ripped from the ground decades ago to warm the homes of nearby villages and the pathway fought through the cold nights. Since then, however, a small number of trees had grown in their forefathers' absence, the largest of which sat in the center of the valley, and in between the 2 charging armies. They had paid it no mind. Just an obstacle to avoid while riding. Nothing more, nothing less. That was until the sky boomed and the world went white. Valaris felt her swift foot stop in its tracks and rear up to its full height, but she could see nothing for a few moments. Only after the whiteness dissipated did she see what had happened. The tree that stood within the center of the valley was suddenly ablaze. Lightning, she thought to herself, but it didn't make sense. She lifted her visor and looked towards the sky. Thick gray clouds rolled through the heavens above, but these weren't storm clouds. She turned back towards the burning tree, and her heart skipped a beat. Before her eyes, she watched as the random flames started to move, not how flames would normally spread. She watched wide-eyed as the fire converged into the center of the tree's trunk and took form. Before her stood a being made of flame, his waist obscured by the fire that raged around him, but his torso, his arms, neck, and head were distinct and visible. Its face was featureless, apart from the wild blue pinpricks where eyes would be. The figure's beady blue eyes stared down upon her, and from the surrounding fire the being unsheathed a mighty flaming sword and pointed it skyward. Ranga stood before his descendant, and her forces, and in a booming, deep voice spoke a single phrase. "Slaughter them!" before he dissipated back into the powerful inferno. Valaris sat awestruck for a moment, stunned by what she had just seen. But after a moment she absorbed her ancestor's words. She turned to her men, who had stopped in their tracks as well. The Queen of Rangaria said nothing. She simply flipped her visor down, raised her spear into the sky, and screamed a mighty battle cry. Her men joined her in her cry. Taltros shielded his eyes as the flash of light flooded the valley, and stopped both armies in their tracks. His swift foot hissed and frantically tried to back up, but Taltros steadied his steed and lowered his arm. Before him sat the tree that moments ago was lush and green, now charred as black as coal. Its branches blazed with orange and yellow flames. Taltros looked around him and tried to make sense of what had just happened, but before any thoughts formed in his head, he heard something subtle, like a distant whisper, but he could tell where it came from. He turned back towards the blackened tree and watched in horror as something formed from the darkness of the charred trunk. A cloaked figure grew from the inky black until its body obscured the roaring flames from Taltros' sight. From within the pitch-black center of the figure's cloak, two equally black arms stretched outwards and then up towards the figure's hood. Long, thin fingers as black as polished obsidian grabbed the edges of the dark being's hood, and with a sudden pull revealed the head beneath. Taltros recognized this figure immediately. Sharos, Oba's angel of punishment, said to bring penance to the wicked in the afterlife, and to steal naughty children from their beds at night to burn them at the stake. Taltros felt himself go limp, and moments later felt a jolt of pain course its way through his body as he hit the ground back first. He quickly tried to rise, but froze again as he looked up and saw the figure, its burning orange eyes staring into his soul. The angel of punishment raised one of its long black fingers and pointed down at the fallen king. It spoke a single word in a hateful, raspy tone that filled him with more terror than any opposing army ever could. Burn! The battle was swift. The Yerovans, suddenly discouraged and disheartened after seeing their king fall to the ground in utter terror, were quickly swarmed and overrun by the more numerous, better equipped, and more confident Rangarian legions. The Rangarian cavalry made quick work of their Yerovan counterparts, and from there made short work of the few Yerovan that were brave enough or stupid enough to stand and fight, Sardantus amongst them. The general, having been knocked down from his swift foot, attempted to stand and fight with his foot soldiers, but a quick slash from a passing Rangarian ranger, Sir Grego Oakley, to be exact, swiftly put an end to his brave strategy. Archers and ballista men made short work of Taltros' proud behemoth forces, and foot soldiers armed with spears and field swords dispatched any of the riders that had survived the behemoth's fall. The Yerovan soldiers that chose to flee into the nearby forest were followed by Rangarian cavalry, and if they weren't impaled by Rangarian steel-tipped spears or arrowheads, they were quickly finished by terrifying war picks or maces. Those foolish enough to try to flee north towards the mountains were pursued as well, but even if most escaped the Rangarian forces, they froze to death in the northern shield. The Battle of Burning Branches was less of a battle and more of a massacre, one that Rangarian bards sang glorious songs about in taverns across the empire, and that the few Yerovan soldiers that managed to survive had nightmares about for the rest of their miserable lives. And King Taltros, He had attempted to rally his men from foot after he fell from his steed, but had failed. Sir Alasar Baker, one of the most powerful rangers in the Empire, was the first Rangarian to spot the foolish king, and had chased him down while riding on the back of his mighty lumberer steed. The king managed to dismount the ranger with the butt of his spear, but that was where his luck ran out. Alasar engaged the king in solo combat, abandoning his own spear in favor of his war pick. The two fought, and while some sources claim the spear-wielding king managed to keep the ranger at bay for a considerable amount of time, most agree that Sir Alasar quickly overwhelmed the monarch and embedded his war pick into the gold-coated cuirass, which knocked Taltros to the ground and took the air from his lungs. Alasar claimed he wanted to kill the king then and there, but decided to let him live, so he could suffer whatever the queen had planned for him. After the battle, the Rangarians displayed what would happen to any Yerevan that dared to march on Rangarian soil. Taltros was stripped naked, and his shins were shattered by maces. Then his body was tied to the back of the queen's swiftfoot, and marched through the northern shield to Ragorn. There, while suffering from horrible internal bleeding and hypothermia, King Taltros the Foolish was chained by his hands and hung above the city's main entrance. Valaris hung him until he died of exposure, dehydration, internal bleeding, or perhaps hypothermia, and stated that leaving him there, exposed above the main gate, was to let Ranga judge the foolish king in life, so he could be punished for all eternity within the flaming pits of the sun. Taltros's Rangarian beloved, Alasar's eldest daughter, Lady Mirella Baker, was sentenced to be burned alive for her crimes against Ranga and his kingdom. Alasar was the one that lit the flame beneath her feet. Months after Taltros's body had rotten into nothing more than maggot-filled meat and brittle bones, Queen Valaris and a group of 100,000 soldiers marched to Yerevan to discuss terms with the new Yerevan king and his advisor, who was at the time his mother, Queen Radaha. Valaris started the discussion by placing Taltros's decapitated, rotting head onto the table. The negotiations were quick, and Yerevan paid the Rangarian Empire 250,000 gold pieces in reparation for the war, which drove the Yerevan kingdom into almost irreversible debt. King Taltros and his failed crusade now serve as a cautionary tale for the Yerevan, a tale of arrogance, sin, and tragedy that soon led to a civil war within the walled kingdom, and reinforced the power of the Oban religion within the city-state. To the Rangarians, it served as a confirmation of their dominance over the West, reinforced the legitimacy of the Stevos dynasty, which had been called into question when Queen Valaris ascended to the throne. Now, as a young, ambitious king sits upon the Yerevan throne, and a bastard sits upon the throne of Rangaria, tides have shifted within the West once again, and tensions have risen. It's only a matter of time before a new crusade starts. The question is, will Rangaria be ready this time around? Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that little short story. I wrote that about a year or two ago. It's set in my fantasy world of Gardia, and takes place about 50 years before the main storyline. I was just making this. I did this little reading for it because I've been wanting to read this story for a long time, and I think it spices up the channel a little bit. Let me know in the comments if you guys enjoyed this, and if you did, maybe I'll make more of these. I don't know. I like this little world that I made, and I would love to tell more stories about it. Alright. Like, comment, subscribe, all that, guys. Have a nice day.